28 August 1945, Le Havre. Afternoon wind coming off the channel carrying a sting of salt and coal smoke. The clatter of tailgates rang across the depot yard as U.S. trucks rolled to a halt beside the wire. German women, former Red Cross nurses, signals auxiliaries, clerks pulled from shattered staffs, stood in the dust. They had learned to ration like bread. Party broadcasts had promised starvation in enemy hands. Some had hidden crusts in their boots through the last marches because hunger felt safer than hope. Then the canvas flaps lifted. Stenciled on wooden crates, U.S. Army, Quartermaster Corps, were the words they were certain they had misread. Beef, Grade A. The smell rose first. A clean animal sweetness turning rich and peppered as M1937 field ranges hissed to life. Fat spattered. A corporal flipped cuts that browned and pooled juices. The air filled with a heat they hadn't felt on their tongues in months. By evening, the light went amber and long. Plates moved down a plank balanced over oil drums. Steak cut thick, a scoop of mashed potatoes beaten smooth, a square of white bread shining with butter. Some women kept their hands behind their backs because that was how you presented yourself for punishment. Others stared until the plates trembled in the cook's hands. A few later wrote that the first bite tasted like a mistake, as if the teeth would find a stone. It wasn't a trick. It was dinner, issued because American regulations, rooted in the 1929 Geneva Convention's requirement that prisoners receive rations equivalent to base troops, said it must be so. In that steam and salt and disbelief, certainty about the enemy began to loosen, and a harder question took its place. How a nation decided to feed those who had sworn to kill it. The answer begins years earlier on paper, long before the ovens were lit. Autumn 1939, Berlin's gray sky hung low over Wilhelmstrasse as loudspeakers crackled to life with Joseph Goebbels' voice, smooth, cold, and certain. The Ministry of Propaganda was already rewriting hunger into a weapon. Posters showed skeletal figures behind barbed wire, their faces labeled German POWs in enemy hands. Radio Berlin warned that surrender meant slavery in coal mines or starvation in foreign fields. Every woman drafted into the Reich's auxiliary services, from the Luftwaffe Communications Corps to the Army's clerical battalions, heard the same refrain. The Anglo-Americans would let them rot. It was not a lie conjured from nothing. Memories of the 1914-1919 Allied blockade, when an estimated 763,000 Germans died from malnutrition, were still raw. Mothers who had buried children during the turnip winter told their daughters never to trust enemy bread. As the Second World War deepened, propaganda became more intimate. Training manuals for Fliegernachrichten Regiment 301 warned that female personnel captured on foreign soil would be dishonored, exploited, and erased. Goebbels' circulars invoked Red Cross failures of 1918, twisting them into proof that conventions were meaningless. Even late in 1944, as Allied bombers turned cities into dust, the Reich's radio called on women to fight to the last. Better to die in uniform than be fed by the enemy. Hunger became virtue, starvation loyalty. By April 1945, when the front collapsed and thousands of German women were captured in France and the Low Countries, many still carried their own rations of black bread and ersatz coffee, convinced they would never eat again. Yet reality moved in a different direction. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had already stockpiled canned meat, flour, and potatoes for an unprecedented prisoner-feeding program. Guided by the 1929 Geneva Convention and a belief that civilization itself required discipline even in victory, American planners built a system designed not for revenge, but for order. The result was a collision between ideology and policy, between a generation taught that mercy was a lie and a nation determined to make it true. That collision would unfold on the first dinner tables of captivity, Geneva. July 1929, delegates from 31 nations crowded into the League of Nations Hall, still haunted by the ghosts of the previous war. The First World War had shown what starvation could do to men behind wire. Millions had suffered, and nations had sworn that it would not happen again. Among the agreements signed that summer, one clause in the New Geneva Convention stood apart. Article 11 declared that prisoners of war must receive the same food as the troops of the government which has captured them. It was an extraordinary sentence, simple but radical, one that made the quality of a captive's meal a measure of a nation's civilization. The United States, proud of its reputation for order and humanitarianism, ratified it within months. The ink dried long before anyone could imagine another world war. But the words would later decide how America would feed her enemies. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the legal principle became a logistical challenge. The Judge Advocate General's office, working closely with the International Red Cross, began converting Geneva's ideals into ration scales, field manuals, and supply routes. Every camp blueprint included kitchens, refrigerated storage, and sanitary water systems. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, under Major General Edmund B. Gregory, formalized the standards: 3,400 calories per prisoner per day, matching the intake of an American soldier on light duty. The menu included bread, potatoes, vegetables, coffee, and when available, meat or milk. Gregory told subordinates that civilization is measured by its treatment of captives, a phrase later quoted in training. Circulars distributed to every POW commandant in the country, while Germany and Japan rationed Allied prisoners at subsistence levels. Washington insisted on full nutritional parity, not only as compliance with law, but as moral weaponry. Feeding the enemy became its own form of propaganda, a declaration that democracy's strength lay in restraint. Those words on paper would soon become stainless steel kitchens, mess halls, and field ranges built to serve tens of thousands of captured soldiers, and eventually, captured women across the American continent. May 1945, the guns had barely gone silent when the roads of Western Germany filled with uniforms that no longer belonged to an army. Among them marched women, thousands of them, wearing Luftwaffe gray, medical armbands, or the blue skirts of flak auxiliaries. They were nurses from field hospitals near Kassel, telegraphists from Fliegernachrichtenregiment 301, typists from shattered staff offices who had watched the Reich collapse one radio order at a time. When they reached Allied checkpoints, they offered identification papers that no one quite knew how to process. The war had made room for women in every corner of the German military machine, but the laws of surrender had not kept pace. To the Americans of Chaef, the sight of columns of young women in regulation boots, their hair cropped and faces drawn, was both an administrative problem and a human. Revelation, at Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, a former resort, hotel hastily converted into a high-security holding site. Interrogators accustomed to generals now found themselves confronting secretaries and nurses, who wept at the word captured. The propaganda of starvation clung to them. Many had not eaten properly in weeks, clutching ration tins long since empty. When orders arrived from chef headquarters, they carried a note of confusion softened by principle. The women were to be classified as disarmed enemy personnel and treated under the same provisions as male POWs. Humane custody, regular rations, medical inspection. Each line echoed the Geneva commitments drafted years earlier. By August, at Le Havre and Cherbourg, the 8th Quartermaster Company had set up field kitchens modeled on the U.S. Army's Type C ration system. Cooks ladled out canned meat, potatoes, and strong coffee into enamel bowls. The smell of salt beef and steam rolled across the wire as disbelief settled over the prisoners. Some stood frozen, too wary to touch the food. Others whispered that it was a trick. But as hunger gave way to taste, the fear began to loosen. For the first time, their fate was measured not in punishment, but in calories. Soon, they would learn that this was only the beginning. Their journey across the Atlantic was waiting. June 1945, the docks of Le Havre were alive with a sound no one had imagined a year earlier. German prisoners boarding American ships, not as spoils of war, but as passengers under protection. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps had turned its Liberty Fleet, those steel workhorses of the Atlantic supply line, into floating extensions of the Geneva Convention. The SS Samuel Chase, SS John Erickson, and sister ships that once carried tanks and ammunition now took on a different cargo, men and women who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler. Their new destination was not a prison in Europe, but a camp in America. The manifest of each vessel listed over 2,000 prisoners, dozens of guards, a medical detachment, and a quartermaster kitchen crew. Below decks, bunks had been welded into tiers. Lifeboat drills replaced roll calls. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and disinfectant, a scent that would stay with them long after the crossing. Twice a day, the field ranges bolted to the weather deck came alive. Smoke curled up from the chimneys as Army cooks prepared meals straight from War Department menu number 24. Corned beef hash, boiled rice, canned peaches, and coffee strong enough to steady a rolling stomach. For many of the female auxiliaries, clerks, flag spotters, and nurses, the white bread and butter alone felt impossible. A few crossed themselves before eating, certain the food was laced or temporary. But when the trays came again the next morning, doubt began to erode. Seasickness and disbelief mixed with something they had forgotten how to feel: safety. The Army Chaplain Corps, monitoring morale aboard the transports, recorded that many prisoners expressed confusion mixed with gratitude. This was no accident. Washington wanted these ships to be as much a message as a means of movement. Each warm meal, each orderly bunk, was part of a quiet campaign to dismantle Goebbels' lies through conduct rather than speeches. By the time the convoys reached Boston and New York in the late summer of 1945, rumors had already spread through the POW channels of the American feasts at sea. What began as a voyage of fear was fast becoming an education in mercy. Autumn 1945, North Louisiana, pine forests shimmered under a heavy sun as trucks from the Kansas City Southern line turned off the dirt road toward Camp Ruston. The war was over, but the fences still stood. Double rows of wire enclosing 770 acres of barracks, guard towers, workshops, and the long, low mess hall where the 475th Quartermaster Battalion ran its daily miracle of order. For 3 years, Ruston had held Italian and German soldiers captured in Afrika and France. Now, for the first time, it received a different kind of prisoner: German women. They arrived in olive-drab rail cars with canvas duffels and a silence thicker than heat. To many, Louisiana might as well have been the edge of the world. They expected scorn, punishment, perhaps hunger. What greeted them instead was the smell of roast beef. Inside the mess hall, American cooks followed the printed War Department menu with near-religious precision: roast beef with brown gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, a slice of white bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. The portions were generous, the flavors shockingly familiar. One female POW later wrote, "We were sure it was poison at first." That entry, recovered from a diary by U.S. intelligence translators, captured the psychological rupture that defined their first days in captivity. Fear could not coexist with apple pie. Within weeks, routine replaced terror. The women were assigned light agricultural work, picking vegetables, sewing uniforms, and in the evenings, Army chaplains organized English lessons in the recreation hall. Outside the wire, curiosity grew. Local townspeople brought fruit, old magazines, and occasionally hymn books. The contrast between propaganda's warnings and Louisiana's hospitality left many German prisoners disoriented, even ashamed. Camp Ruston became not just a holding site, but a living demonstration of American ideals, the blueprint for how a victorious democracy fed its enemies and dismantled hatred through habit. Yet back home, not everyone approved. Letters to newspapers questioned why steak dinners were being served to those who had worn Hitler's eagle. That debate, quietly brewing beyond the pine trees, would soon test whether America's mercy could survive its own anger. By the winter of 1945, America's greatest unseen army wore aprons, not helmets. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, often dismissed as the war's accountants and cooks, had become the logistical backbone of a moral campaign. Every steak, every loaf of bread served to a German prisoner passed through a machine of staggering precision. At its peak, the Corps was feeding more than 400,000 Axis POWs scattered across 500 Lund camps stretching from Maine to California. From regional depots in Chicago, New Orleans, and San Antonio, refrigerated trains rolled out daily, their manifests listing tons of beef, potatoes, flour, coffee, and canned fruit. In each freight car, the temperature was held steady at 38 degrees by compressors that never slept, ensuring that even in captivity, the enemy would eat fresh. The standard was the Type A ration, 400 calories per day, matching the diet of U.S. soldiers on home duty. Each camp kitchen became an industrial theater of discipline. Field ranges M1937, fueled by gasoline and designed to feed 100 men apiece, lined the mess halls in rows. Cooks weighed portions with the same precision that gunners once used for shells. For female prisoners, quartermaster nutritionists introduced adjusted menus, slightly smaller servings, but identical nutritional balance. Red Cross inspectors arriving unannounced recorded their astonishment. One 1946 report from the Geneva delegation described the meals as comparable to those provided to American troops, exceeding expectations under wartime conditions. To the War Department, these meals were more than sustenance. They were strategy. Feeding the enemy well projected an image of control, abundance, and moral superiority. In the ruins of fascist ideology, food became propaganda with the power to disarm resentment. Yet not everyone applauded. As quartermaster trains kept rolling, congressional letters and editorials began asking whether generosity had gone too far, whether feeding former Nazis steak while veterans scraped by at home betrayed something of justice. The debate would soon reach Washington, where ideals of mercy would collide with the politics of ration cards. By early 1946, the war had ended. But a new battle was being fought across America's newspapers and dinner tables, a battle over conscience. Reports from Camp Ruston, Fort Oglethorpe, and other POW sites began leaking into the press. Journalists described German prisoners, even women in Luftwaffe uniforms, eating roast beef, drinking milk, and finishing with apple pie. To a nation still rationing sugar and butter, it struck a nerve. The Chicago Tribune ran letters asking why Nazis dine while Americans ration. In Texas, the Dallas Morning News printed a farmer's complaint that his own children hadn't seen steak in months while Hitler's helpers were served it daily. Public sentiment, raw from years of sacrifice, demanded to know whether mercy had become waste. In Washington, Senator William Langer of North Dakota seized the outrage, calling for a Senate inquiry into War Department food allocations for enemy prisoners. Yet inside the Pentagon, the defense was firm. Major General Louis B. Hershey of the Selective Service System argued that the feeding policy was not indulgence, but strategy. "We show who the civilized truly are," he wrote in a 1946 memorandum, "not by how we treat our friends, but by how we feed our enemies." Religious organizations joined the chorus of defense. The YMCA, Quakers, and Catholic War Relief Services sent volunteers to POW camps with English-language Bibles, hymnals, and donated books, turning the act of feeding into a form of quiet re-education. The results were tangible. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office noted a sharp decline in escape attempts, fights, and illness among well-fed prisoners. For many female auxiliaries, the contrast between Nazi warnings and American conduct became impossible to reconcile. Kindness bred introspection. Gratitude became an unintended tool of denazification. As tempers cooled, the steak dinners that once inflamed the public came to symbolize something larger, a nation testing its conscience and proving that victory, at its highest form, was moral as well as military. That realization would soon ripple beyond the camps, shaping America's global image in the fragile dawn of peace. By February 1946, the U.S. military had begun to understand that what it served on a plate could achieve what no interrogation ever could. Inside the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and the Psychological Warfare Division, analysts compiled studies with titles like Effect of Ration Quality on Prisoner Attitudes. Their findings were stark. German prisoners who ate well showed higher cooperation, lower aggression, and greater receptivity to re-education. The U.S. had discovered that the route to ideological surrender ran through the stomach. At camps such as Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, where female Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht auxiliaries were held in temporary barracks, mealtime was transformed from routine into ritual. After dinner, loudspeakers played swing records and film reels of democratic life in America flickered against canvas screens. Between the smell of coffee and the sight of laughing civilians, the walls built by years of propaganda began to crumble. Psychologists observed that the women, in particular, reacted with quiet disbelief. Interviews recorded by Army interpreters noted phrases like, "We were told the Americans were beasts, yet they feed us like family." The humane treatment became more than charity. It was precision-engineered persuasion. The same quartermaster menus that satisfied the Geneva Convention now served as instruments of psychological warfare, replacing fear with cognitive dissonance. The U.S. military called it attitude conditioning. Historians later called it psychological disarmament. By spring, internal OSS memoranda described the process as a soft conquest, a campaign in which generosity, not punishment, achieved ideological victory. As the Allied Control Council prepared Europe's formal denazification programs, lessons from the POW camps were quietly folded into post-war policy. America had learned that mercy could be militarized, that bread could dismantle belief. In the end, the most potent weapon of democracy was not the bomb or the bayonet, but the hand that offered food across the wire. By late 1945, as American soldiers demobilized and factories retooled for peace, another quiet workforce was keeping the nation's production lines alive: the prisoners of war. Under Article 27 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, the United States legally employed POWs in non-combat labor to offset domestic shortages. What began as a necessity soon became an experiment in humanity. Across hundreds of camps, German men and a smaller number of women rose before dawn to work in fields, sawmills, and canneries. At Camp Hearne, Texas, female auxiliaries who once decoded Luftwaffe transmissions now packed rations bound for troops still stationed in the Pacific. The pay was modest, 80 cents per day in canteen credits, but the work restored something that captivity had stolen: dignity. Every shift ended with a meal that could have come from any American cafeteria: beef stew simmered with onions, fresh vegetables from local farms, and thick slices of white bread delivered each morning from a Hearne bakery. Red Cross inspectors repeatedly noted the connection between nourishment and morale, recording that nutrition and labor discipline were directly proportional. As physical strength returned, so did civility. The women who had arrived hollow-eyed from Europe now kept tidy work logs, exchanged English lessons with guards, and wrote letters that the censors found unexpectedly grateful. "We eat well," one wrote home, "and we are treated as people, not enemies." Outside the wire, Texas farmers who supervised work details began inviting prisoners to share lunch under the open sky. Those small acts, passing a biscuit, pouring coffee, bridged what speeches never could. The POW labor program proved that humane treatment bred not softness, but stability, turning ideology into industry. Yet as repatriation orders loomed in 1946, a new anxiety surfaced among the women, returning to a defeated homeland where food, not captivity, might again be scarce. Their gratitude, quiet, handwritten, and heartfelt, became one of America's most persuasive post-war exports. By the summer of 1946, the camps began to empty as quietly as they had filled. Orders for repatriation swept across the POW system like a tide turning. In Louisiana, Texas, and Georgia, columns of German prisoners, men and women alike, lined up for roll call, their duffels lighter than when they had arrived. Liberty ships once again waited at American ports: SS Zebulon Pike, SS Admiral Benson, and others, their decks scrubbed clean for the long voyage east. For many of the women from Camp Ruston and Fort Oglethorpe, this would be their last taste of America, quite literally. The War Department had issued instructions that every departing group should be given a farewell meal commensurate with American hospitality. It was a bureaucratic phrase that translated on the plate into generosity. That evening, in mess halls lit by low bulbs and stirred air fans, cooks served steak with mashed potatoes, canned peaches, white bread, and coffee. The smell filled the barracks like a benediction. Some of the women tried to smile. Others cried openly over their trays. The thought of returning to a Germany still rationing calories, still cold and hungry, made the meal feel both blessing and cruelty. An army chaplain at Camp Hearne recorded in his log, "They fear their freedom. They have grown accustomed to order, to enough food, to kindness." Across dozens of camps, the same scene repeated, a strange communion between enemies who no longer were. When the ships reached Bremerhaven and Cuxhaven in 1947, Red Cross officers documented their surprise. The repatriated prisoners were healthier than many civilians awaiting them. Photographs of well-fed German POWs circulated in newspapers across the American and British zones, undercutting Soviet claims of Western brutality. The final American meal, humble but abundant, had become an act of diplomacy. It was proof that mercy could outlast war, that decency could endure even in defeat. In the quiet after the plates were cleared, both sides seemed to understand that something larger than victory had been preserved. By 1947, as the last prisoner ships docked and the camp stood empty, the legacy of America's feeding policy had already begun to take root in doctrine. What had started as a wartime obligation under the Geneva Convention evolved into a moral framework for how a superpower should act in victory. The War Department's after-action reports, circulated among policymakers and military educators, concluded that humane rations had produced measurable stability, compliance, and goodwill. Within 5 years, the principle became codified in the Armed Forces Manual as the doctrine of rations of parity, guaranteeing that prisoners under U.S. control would always receive food equivalent to American troops. The idea was no longer a courtesy. It was national policy, drawn directly from the experience of feeding former enemies steak dinners instead of punishment. In occupied Germany, the same spirit extended beyond the camps. The newly founded CARE organization, its first shipments of food parcels leaving American ports in 1946, was staffed by veterans of quartermaster logistics who had once fed POWs. Millions of Germans, including many former auxiliaries, now received tins of coffee, flour, and meat marked "From the American People." The gesture reversed the direction of charity, the conqueror feeding the conquered not from pity, but from principle. Former German prisoners, especially women who had lived through the Louisiana and Texas camps, wrote letters of gratitude to their former captors. Some even returned decades later as immigrants, citing the kindness they had witnessed as their first glimpse of a different world. Psychologists, tracking post-war attitudes, found an enduring pattern. Those who had experienced humane treatment in U.S. custody harbored less resentment and showed greater trust in Western institutions. Feeding one's enemies, it seemed, had rewritten the moral script of modern warfare. The last steak served in 1945 had long since been digested, yet its nourishment endured, in policy, in memory, and in the quiet architecture of peace that followed. August 1945 had begun with fear and ended with a meal. For the German women who once braced for starvation behind barbed wire, that first plate of American food became a paradox they could never quite resolve. It was defeat served warm, captivity flavored with mercy. The steak and mashed potatoes were less memorable for their taste than for what they symbolized, that the victors had chosen discipline over vengeance. History would later catalog the U.S. Army's rations as mere logistics, 300-400 calories, standardized menus, balanced nutrients, but to those who ate them, they were proof that civilization had survived the war it nearly destroyed. In a century that had industrialized death, something as ordinary as a hot meal became radical. The smell of roasted meat, the gleam of butter, the quiet insistence of coffee poured without cruelty. These details lingered longer than any speech about democracy. Years later, as Germany rebuilt itself from ruins, those same women told their children about the day the enemy fed them like family. The memory spread quietly, carried in kitchens rather than textbooks, a reminder that power need not humiliate to prove its strength. In the end, the United States fed not only prisoners, but an idea that victory could taste like compassion, and that even in the ashes of total war, humanity could still serve itself with dignity.